a cleaning girl, a golden locket, and a secret buried for 26 years. What if I told you that the most feared mafia boss in the city just grabbed a poor orphan by the wrist in front of everyone? What if I told you that a single piece of jewelry could prove she is the daughter everyone thought died in a horrific car crash decades ago? But here is the twist that will shake you to your core. The man who raised the mafia boss, the man who everyone trusted, the man who built an empire on loyalty and honor. He is the very same monster who murdered her mother and left a newborn baby to die in the wreckage. And for 26 years, nobody knew. Tonight, we uncover a story of betrayal so deep it will make your blood run cold. A story of a promise kept across decades, and a reunion that will break your heart into 1,000 pieces before putting it back together again. This story will remind you that no matter how dark your past, no matter how lost you feel, family has a way of finding you. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always rises to the surface. Now, let the story begin. That necklace is an Ashford family heirloom. The roar ripped through the dining hall, shattering the air of polite conversation. Damon Blackwood, the most dreaded mafia boss in Blackwood City, leaped from his chair. His face was a mask of pure fury as he pointed directly at a young cleaning girl. Ivy stopped dead in the middle of the room, a dirty rag clutched in her fist. She felt her blood run cold. She instinctively dropped the cloth and covered the golden locket at her throat with both hands. "Sir, I did not steal this," she stammered, backing away. "I swear it." Damon did not hear her. He kicked over a chair that stood in his way and advanced on her like an approaching hurricane. The patrons at the surrounding tables scattered, horrified by the anger pouring off the man whose very name made hardened criminals flinch. "Do not lie to me," Damon snarled, trapping her against a stone column. "I have been searching for that necklace since I was a child. Where did you find it? Answer me." The restaurant manager, Harrison, scurried over, his face pale with alarm. "Mr. Blackwood, please be calm." Harrison tried to place himself between them, his hands up in a gesture of peace. "My deepest apologies, sir. This girl is new. She is obviously just a worthless little thief." He spun on Ivy, his tone becoming ice. "You are fired. Leave now before I involve the authorities." Harrison seized Ivy's arm and began to pull her roughly toward the back. Ivy cried out from the sharp pain, but before she could struggle, a stronger hand clamped down on the manager's wrist. It squeezed until the man's knuckles turned white. It was Damon. "Let her go." His voice was a low, menacing threat. "If you touch her again, I promise you I will tear this place down, and you will be under it." Harrison instantly released her. He stumbled backward, trembling, his hands raised in surrender. "But Mr. Blackwood, she stole the family crest. Be quiet and get out of my sight." Damon did not even look at him. His attention returned to Ivy. He was so close she could smell the fine whiskey on his breath and see the deep pain burning in his dark eyes. "Give me the locket." He held out his open palm. "No." Ivy shook her head, clutching the piece of jewelry desperately. "It is mine. It is the only thing my mother ever gave me. I have had it since I was born." "Liar." Damon's fist smashed into the pillar, the sound cracking through the silent hall. "Catherine Ashford wore that the night she was killed. There were no survivors from that wreck. Not one." Ivy flinched. But some small piece of defiance, the kind only found in a person who has nothing left, made her move. With trembling fingers, she unhooked the chain, took off the necklace, and held it out to the most powerful man in the city. But she did not give it to him. "If you think I am a thief," her voice shook but held steady, "then you tell me the engraving on the back. If it belongs to your family, you would know it." Damon froze. He seemed to stop breathing. The inscription, his voice suddenly went soft, filled with a profound sadness. "It says V and C, forever. Victor and Catherine, forever." Ivy slowly flipped the locket over in her palm. The light from the chandelier caught the worn initials carved into the old gold. V and C. Forever. A strangled sound escaped Damon's throat. He snatched the necklace from her, his fingers shaking as he traced the letters again and again, as if he could not believe it was real. This cannot be possible. He looked up, his eyes boring into hers. How old are you? 26. What is your birthday? I do not know the exact day, Ivy answered, rubbing the bare skin of her neck. I was found on November 15th. Damon's entire world came to a halt. November 15th was the date of the ambush. It was the night he, as an 11-year-old boy, watched Catherine Ashford's car go over the side of Raven's Peak. It was the night they buried her, along with the unborn child everyone assumed had died with her. But if nobody survived, how was this girl here, wearing a sacred heirloom that only passed from one blood relative to another? This golden pendant holds a truth that has been buried for more than 2 decades. If you want to uncover the dark secret behind the massacre with us, hit that like button to fuel this story. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a chapter. Share this with someone who loves a good mystery. They will thank you later. Damon spoke no more. He took Ivy by the wrist and pulled her right through the dining room, ignoring the shocked stares of the other patrons. Ivy tried to pull her hand away, but the man's grip was like steel, completely unbreakable. They walked down a long hall and stopped at a heavy wooden door. Damon threw it open, pushed her inside, and then locked it behind them. The opulent private room, with its black leather couch and crystal lights, instantly felt like a prison. Damon faced the 2 guards in the hall and gave a command that left no room for debate. Nobody in, nobody out. Is that clear? The 2 men gave sharp nods. The door clicked shut. Ivy retreated to a corner, pressing her back against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw Damon take out his phone to make a call. His voice was cold as he spoke. Dr. Hammond, I need you to bring a DNA kit to the Skyline restaurant immediately. Private room number 3, this is not a request. He hung up without waiting for a reply. I am not your captive, Ivy said. Her voice was unsteady, but she forced herself to sound strong. You have no right to hold me here. Damon turned to face her. His dark eyes seemed like 2 endless wells. You will stay until I have my answer. An answer to what? Ivy demanded. Damon was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with an immeasurable exhaustion. For all the years I have spent waiting. Ivy had no idea what he meant, but she could hear the agony in his voice, a kind of suffering that had gone on for far too long, settling deep into his bones. Damon moved closer. Tell me about your childhood. Everything you can remember. Ivy swallowed hard. I was raised at St. Mary's Orphanage. I have no idea who my parents are. The nuns told me I was left on their doorstep during a terrible storm. What else? Damon insisted. Ivy paused for a moment. I was wrapped in an old leather jacket. Sister Agatha said it smelled of motor oil and smoke. She saved it for me, but it fell apart over time. The necklace was the only thing that lasted. Damon stopped. A leather jacket. The scent of motor oil. He filed that detail away. It was important. He did not know how yet, but the instincts of a man who had clawed his way through the criminal world told him it was a clue he could not dismiss. 40 minutes later, the door swung open. Middle-aged man wearing gold-framed glasses entered, holding a black medical case. Dr. Hammond, the personal doctor for the Ashford family. He did not ask any questions. He silently took a sample of Ivy's blood and then got to work with the equipment in his bag. An unbearable silence filled the room. Ivy sat on the couch, her hands twisted together in her lap. Damon stood by the window with his back to her, gazing out at the city lights, as if searching for a ghost. 20 minutes felt like 20 years. Finally, Dr. Hammond spoke. His voice was shaking slightly. I have the results. Damon spun around. Tell me. Dr. Hammond stared at his screen, then looked up at Ivy with an expression of pure disbelief. Her DNA is a 99.97% match to the sample on file for Catherine Ashford. It felt like the world stopped spinning. Ivy felt the floor drop out from under her. She tried to speak, but no words would come out. Damon stood as still as a statue. All this time, his voice was a raw, broken whisper. You were alive. You were alive all this time. While we thought you were gone, while Victor cried himself to sleep every night, while I searched the entire world for a ghost. Ivy finally found her voice. Who am I? Damon walked over and stood in front of her. This time there was no anger in his eyes. There was only something deeper, more powerful, like a flame that had been buried for 26 years and was now roaring to life. You are Rosalie Ashford, he said, speaking each word slowly, as if she might not hear him. The only child of Victor and Catherine Ashford, the lost princess of this family. Ivy just shook her head. No, that is impossible. I am just an orphan. I clean floors for a living. I am not a princess. Damon did not reply. He turned to Dr. Hammond. Get the car ready. Then he looked back at Ivy, his expression leaving no room for argument. She is coming home tonight. A convoy of 3 polished black Rolls-Royce cars moved silently through the deserted streets of Blackwood City. Ivy sat in the back with Damon, staring out the window but seeing nothing. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl of everything that had just unfolded. Rosalie Ashford. The name echoed in her mind like a church bell ringing from a world that was never hers. After 20 minutes, the cars pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate. The gate swung open, and Ivy gasped as she saw the Ashford property for the first time. It was not a house. It was a castle. It had tall, white columns, huge windows glowing with warm light, and a sprawling garden with a marble fountain in the center. Ivy had spent her life in tiny, cold apartments, and now she was here. Damon held the car door for her. Ivy got out, her legs feeling a little weak. She tried to appear composed, but her heart was racing. Damon led her up to the main entrance, a massive oak door covered in detailed carvings. It opened into a great hall with a sky-high ceiling and a giant crystal chandelier sparkling above them. This is your home, Damien said. It has always been your home. Ivy could not find her voice before a weak sound echoed from the end of the hall. Damien, is that you? Bring her to me. They moved through a long corridor and stopped in front of a large room. Damien swung the door open. Inside, an old man was sitting in a wheelchair next to the fireplace. His name was Victor Ashford. He was 68 years old, but looked closer to 80. His hair was completely white. His eyes were clouded from age, and maybe from too many tears. His face was thin, all sharp bones, like a man who had suffered for far too long. But when he saw the token hanging at Ivy's throat, everything about him changed. Victor Ashford started to shake. His thin hands clutched the wheelchair's arms. Tears filled his faded eyes and ran down his wrinkled face. He tried to get up, but his legs had no strength left. Damien moved quickly to steady him. Victor walked toward Ivy, taking slow, careful steps. He seemed afraid she would disappear if he moved too quickly. He raised a trembling hand and touched Ivy's cheek. His skin felt cold and dry, but his touch held a gentleness she had never experienced from anyone in her life. My daughter, Victor whispered, his voice thick with emotion. My Rosalie, you have your mother's eyes. You have Catherine's eyes. Ivy just stood there, unsure of what she should do. For her whole life, she had dreamed of having a family. She dreamed of someone calling her their daughter. Now it was real, and she had no idea how to react. I do not know what to say, she managed to get out. You do not have to say a thing, Victor said, while tears continued to fall. You just need to be here. I have waited for this day since that terrible night. I believed you were gone. I believed I would never see you again. Then he pulled her into an embrace. His arms were frail, but they held her tightly, as if she would vanish if he let go. His shoulders trembled as he sobbed. Catherine. Victor cried out his wife's name between broken sobs. Catherine, our daughter is back. Can you see? She is finally home. And Ivy, a girl who had never been held by anyone in her entire life, a girl who had never been called daughter, a girl who taught herself not to cry when she was just a small child, suddenly felt something inside her break. Tears poured from her eyes. They were unstoppable. She wept for the mother whose face she never knew. She wept for the father who had been waiting for her for a quarter of a century. Much later, when they were both calm again, Victor sat back in his chair. He still held Ivy's hand, terrified she might disappear. His expression turned serious. You must know the truth, he said, his voice becoming low. Your mother's crash. That was not an accident. Ivy stared at him, confused. What are you talking about, sir? Damien moved to stand beside Victor. It was a planned assassination, he said. Catherine's car was intentionally pushed off the cliff. Someone wanted her to die. Victor's grip on Ivy's hand became tighter. The enemies of our family are still out there, hiding. I have searched for 26 years, but I could not find them. And now you are here, with the token around your neck. They will know. They will know you survived. Ivy felt the blood run cold in her veins. So that means. Victor nodded slowly. You are in danger, he said, his voice full of both pain and resolve. But I will not lose you this time. I will protect you, even if it costs me my own life. Ivy could not sleep during her first night at the Ashford estate. The room she was given was bigger than any apartment she had ever lived in. It had a 4-poster bed with white silk sheets and curtains of deep red velvet. But all that luxury gave her no comfort. She tossed and turned for hours, her thoughts racing with everything that had happened. Finally, she gave up trying to rest. She put on a light robe and walked out onto the balcony. Blackwood City spread out below her like a sea of lights. The night air was cold and unforgiving as it blew through her hair. Ivy stood gripping the railing with both hands, staring down at the view without really seeing it. You cannot sleep. A low, warm voice spoke from behind her. Ivy spun around. Damien was leaning in the doorway. His arms were crossed over his chest, his face half in moonlight and half in shadow. Neither can you, Ivy said back. Damien did not respond immediately. He walked onto the balcony to stand next to her, and they both looked out at the city. A long silence passed between them before he spoke again. I was 11 on that terrible night. I was living on the streets, stealing what I needed to eat, and sleeping in dirty alleys. Then Victor found me. He gave me a place to live, a family, and a purpose. Ivy remained quiet, listening. She could sense the heavy burden in every word he spoke. That night, the night of the crash, I was in the car right behind Victor. Damien continued, his voice even lower now. We were taking Catherine home from the hospital. She was 8 months pregnant with you. He paused, his jaw clenched, as if holding back a wave of emotion. I saw the whole thing, he said. The cars appeared from the darkness. They rammed Catherine's car off the road. I watched it go over the cliff. I watched it burst into flames. Ivy felt her chest tighten. Damien looked at her, his dark eyes like 2 deep pools of blackness. The way Victor screamed that night. I will never be able to forget it. He screamed Catherine's name. He screamed for his unborn child. He wanted to jump off the cliff right after her. And I, just an 11-year-old boy, had to hold him back. What happened after that? Ivy asked. Her voice was just a faint whisper. That night, after everything was over, I knelt in front of Victor. Damien said, I made a promise. You promised what? Damien looked directly into her eyes. The moonlight hit his face, highlighting his sharp features and the fierce resolve that burned in his stare. I promised I would find the people who did it and make them pay. I promised I would find the child, if she was still alive. I promised I would protect the Ashford family with my own life. He adopted me. He gave me control of his entire empire when I turned 18. I did not become the boss because I wanted the power. I became the boss because I needed the power to fulfill my promise. Ivy looked at him, and in that moment, she understood. His cold attitude, the cruel things people said about him. It all started on that stormy night so long ago. Have you found the person responsible? She asked. Damien was quiet for a very long time. Then he looked away, his figure tall and alone in the moonlight. Not yet, he answered. They have covered their tracks too well. I have spent decades tearing the entire criminal world apart, and I still have not found them. But things will change now that you are here. How will they be different? Ivy asked. Damien turned back to face her. His look was as sharp and cold as a knife. The enemy will finally come out of hiding. Because you, Rosalie Ashford, are the perfect trap. The next few days felt like a strange dream. Ivy was not sure if she wanted to wake up or run away. They treated her like a real princess. Servants gave her dozens of beautiful dresses, shoes, and pieces of jewelry. Her room was filled with fresh flowers every single day. A personal chef would ask her what she wanted for every meal. Every person working at the estate would lower their head when she passed by. But Ivy did not feel happy. She felt like she was suffocating. She was used to fending for herself, eating plain food, and cleaning floors to earn money. This new life of luxury felt like wearing clothes that were much too big for her. She did not know how to act in it. On the morning of the third day, a man entered the large sitting room where Ivy was alone. He was around 55 years old, with dark, neatly combed hair. He wore a perfectly fitted gray suit and had a warm smile. "Welcome home, Miss Ashford," he said. His voice was smooth and controlled. "My name is Marcus Kane. I am Damien's most trusted advisor. I have been with this family since before you were born." Ivy just stood there, unsure of what to say. "Hello," she managed. Marcus moved toward her, presenting a bouquet of stark white roses that he placed on a nearby table. "A small token to welcome you," he explained. "I want you to know, Damien can appear distant, but he has spent his entire adult life trying to find you. A full quarter of a century. He never once gave up. You are the only thing that gives him any faith." Ivy glanced from the flowers to Marcus. He seemed genuine. His smile was warm and his eyes looked kind. "Thank you," she said softly. "I am still trying to process all of this." Marcus gave an understanding nod. "I know. This is an incredible adjustment, but you have no reason to be afraid. We are all here to keep you safe." He spent the whole morning showing her around the vast estate, explaining the history of each room and sharing tales of the Ashford family. His tone was consistently gentle and patient, like a favorite uncle. Later that afternoon, a different guest was announced. Preston Cole, a man of 55 and a long-standing business associate of the family. He had dark hair streaked with gray, a strong jawline, and wore a finely tailored black suit. As he walked into the drawing room and saw Ivy, his face lit up with a brilliant smile. "It is a miracle," he declared. "Victor's daughter is truly alive. The Ashford family has been given a great gift." Preston came closer to shake her hand, but in the brief instant their skin made contact, a cold feeling of wrongness shot through Ivy. His smile was enormous, but his eyes were like ice. They were completely cold. It only lasted for a moment before it was gone. "Thank you," Ivy said, making sure her voice was even. Preston did not visit for long. He talked with Victor for a bit, then said he had to leave to find Damien. As the two men were standing in the hallway, Ivy happened to walk by and heard a piece of their talk. "Are you certain she is who she says she is?" Preston's voice was quiet. "This is not some kind of trick. DNA results are easy to fake. You need to be cautious." "She is Victor's daughter." Damien's voice was like steel. "The token is never wrong." "I only want what is best for the family," Preston said. "You are aware of how many people want to use Catherine's death as a way to take over Ashford." "Assets?" Ivy slipped away before they could see she was listening. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was not sure what to make of Preston Cole, but the thing that truly chilled her happened later that evening. As she made her way down the east corridor to her room, she spotted Marcus and Preston in a shadowed corner, deep in a private conversation. They were standing close, their heads bent together, their voices a low murmur. Ivy could not make out the words, but the looks on their faces were serious. Then Marcus looked up and saw her. That easy grin instantly appeared on his face. "Miss Ashford," he called out, his tone bright and cheerful, as if nothing was wrong. "You are up late." Preston turned too, gave her a curt nod, and then walked off without a word. "Just business," Marcus explained when he saw the question in Ivy's eyes. "Nothing for you to be concerned about. Sleep well." Ivy just nodded and returned to her room. But as she lay in the darkness, sleep would not come. Something was deeply wrong. She could feel it in her soul. Marcus's smile had been too quick. Preston's stare had been too cold. And that hushed conversation in the shadows. What was it about? She did not have the answer yet. But she understood one thing clearly. Inside this estate, not everyone was on her side. In the days that followed, Ivy noticed a disturbing pattern. No matter where she went on the property, Damien was always there. It was not a coincidence. It was not random. He followed her like a shadow tied to her heels. When she came down for breakfast, he was already at the table. When she walked in the garden, he would be on a balcony, looking down at her. When she went to the library to read, he would show up 10 minutes later, claiming he needed to find some documents. And that was not all. Ivy saw that the male servants around the estate were slowly disappearing. In their place were only women. When she finally asked a maid about it, the young woman ducked her head and whispered that Mr. Blackwood had ordered all male staff moved to a different wing. No reason was given, but everyone knew why. A week later, Ivy reached her breaking point. She found Damien in his office and threw the door open without bothering to knock. Damien looked up from a stack of papers, his dark eyes meeting hers with no surprise at all, as if he had been expecting her. "You are watching me 24/7, Ivy said directly, her voice shaking with fury. "I cannot breathe. I cannot go anywhere without someone following me. I cannot speak to anyone without being watched. Is this supposed to be protection, or am I a prisoner?" Damien rose from his chair, circled the desk, and began to walk toward her. "I am protecting you." Ivy let out a laugh that had no humor in it. "You have removed every man from my section of the house. You decide who I can see, what I am allowed to say, and where I can go. That is not protection. That is possession." Damien stopped right in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. "You do not understand." His voice dropped, losing its cold edge and taking on something deeper, more raw. "For 26 years, I have lived with that promise. All that time, I searched for you in utter despair. I looked under every rock. I walked down every dark alley. I questioned hundreds of people, and I found nothing, not a single clue. I was sure you were dead. I thought I would never be able to keep my promise to Victor." He raised his hand, as if to touch her face, but his fingers stopped just millimeters from her skin. He froze, almost afraid that his touch would make her vanish. "Now you are here," he said. "Real, made of flesh and blood, and I will never let anyone hurt you. No one, not even me, if I want to make my own choices?" Ivy asked, her voice softer now but still firm. Damien stared directly into her eyes. Not even that. They stood in a silent battle of wills. Neither of them would back down. In the end, Ivy was the one to break the silence. She turned and left the room, her emotions in a storm. She despised being controlled, but a part of her understood the reason for his actions. And because she understood, she could not bring herself to truly hate him. That night, Ivy's sleep was filled with nightmares. She dreamed of a car screaming off a cliff on a night soaked with rain, the shriek of twisting metal, the explosion of shattering glass, the terrified scream of a woman. Then there was fire, an inferno that consumed everything. She shot up in bed, covered in a cold sweat, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she thought it would break free. She sat there for a long moment, forcing her breathing to steady. Then she got up and went to the door. She had to get some air. She needed to escape that room, if only for a minute. But when she pulled the door open, she froze in place. Damien was there, just outside. He was leaning against the opposite wall, his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes closed. But he was not relaxed. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to spring into action. The moment the door opened, his eyes snapped open. In the dim light of the hallway, those dark eyes were sharp, but they held no threat. "What are you doing out here?" Ivy asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Standing watch," Damien replied, his tone blunt and simple. "You have dozens of bodyguards. Why do you need to do this yourself?" "Because I do not trust anyone else," he said, and the answer was immediate. Ivy swallowed hard. "You do this every single night?" A heavy silence filled the space between them. Damien did not have to answer. The silence said everything. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, her voice softening. Damien just looked at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, tired sound. "I have not had a single peaceful night since I was 11 years old. Every time I close my eyes, I see that car going over the edge of the cliff. Every night I hear Victor's screams. At least now, when I am awake, I have a purpose. I have someone I need to protect." Ivy stood there, staring at him. This was the most powerful man in the city, the mafia boss that made the entire criminal world cower. And here he was, standing guard outside her door every night, sleepless, just to ensure that she was safe. For the very first time, she was not afraid of him. She felt pity. Pity for the 11-year-old boy who had to witness such a horror. Pity for the man who had carried that terrible burden for more than 20 years. She did not say another word. She simply turned and went back into her room. But as she shut the door, she did not latch it completely. She left it open a tiny crack, letting a narrow blade of light slice through the darkness of the hall, like an unspoken invitation, or perhaps a promise that she was not going to run away. After that night, Ivy could not get the image of Damien out of her mind. She thought about him standing watch, about Preston Cole's cold stare, about Marcus Kane's smile that never quite reached his eyes. She thought about her mother's murder 26 years ago, and the person responsible who was still free. She refused to be a passive pawn, waiting for others to save her. She had to know the truth, and she would find it herself. 3 nights later, as the clock showed 2 in the morning, Ivy crept out of her room. She knew Damien was usually right outside her door. But tonight, he was in an urgent meeting with his men and had not come back yet. This was her window. Her bare feet were silent on the ice-cold marble. She moved like a ghost through the darkened hallway, skillfully avoiding the security cameras she had carefully mapped out over the last few days. The records archive was located in the basement, a room she had stumbled upon when Marcus gave her a tour of the estate. The door to the archive was not locked. Ivy slipped inside and used the small flashlight on her phone to see. Rows of tall metal shelves stood like silent sentinels, all of them filled with boxes of files. She started her search, her fingertips brushing over label after label. Business contracts, financial reports, employee records. And then, she saw it. It was an old, dusty metal box with a faint, handwritten label on the front. The incident of November 15th. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid. Inside, there was a thick folder. The paper was brittle and yellowed with time. She devoured the pages, reading with a desperate hunger in the narrow beam of her flashlight. There was the official report from the scene. Photos of a charred car wreck at the base of the cliff. A list of the victims. Catherine Ashford, age 32, 8 months pregnant, pronounced dead at the scene. The driver was also deceased. The fetus, body never recovered, presumed deceased. Ivy forced herself to swallow and continued reading. She stopped when she reached a typed page with the title, Internal Security Analysis. Her eyes grew wide as she read the words. Catherine Ashford's travel plans for the night of November 15th were highly confidential. Only a very small group of people within the organization knew the exact time and the route she would take. Below that was a list of names. Victor Ashford, Damian Blackwood, 11 years old, the private driver, deceased. And there was one more name, but it had been obliterated. It was not crossed out with a pen. It had been intentionally scraped off the page, leaving a ghostly white scar on the paper. Ivy's heart began to hammer against her chest. Someone had erased their name from this list. Someone did not want anyone to know they were aware of Catherine's plans that night. Who was it? And was that the person who had betrayed her mother? She turned the page. It was an additional report from the investigation. Unidentified witness. The description read as follows: male, middle-aged, wearing a worn leather jacket, riding an old motorcycle. He was seen near the accident site approximately 30 minutes after the crash. He appeared to be carrying something as he left. His identity was unknown. The investigation was not pursued. Ivy went completely still. The leather jacket. Sister Agatha had told her that she was found wrapped in an old leather jacket when she was left on the orphanage steps. The distinct smell of engine oil and cigarettes. An old motorcycle. The pieces clicked into place. This man was there. This man took something from the scene of the crash. That something was her. This man was the one who saved her life. She had to find him. He was the one person alive who knew what really happened that night. And in that very moment, the door to the archive swung open. Ivy whipped around, instinctively hiding the folder behind her back. Light poured in from the hallway, outlining a figure in the doorway. It was Marcus Kane. He was dressed in a suit, even at this late hour. His hair was perfectly styled, and he had that familiar smile on his face. But there was no warmth in his gaze. Those eyes were like chips of ice. He stood like a shadow with a knife's edge. "It is getting late, miss," Marcus said. His voice was soft, yet it carried a threat that made the hairs on Ivy's arms stand up. "What are you searching for down here?" Ivy forced her own voice to sound steady. "I only wanted to learn about my family," she answered. "About my mother." Marcus moved inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The click of the latch echoed like a trap springing shut. "Curiosity is a fine thing," he said, stepping toward her. "But some things are not for you to know, miss. Certain secrets are meant to stay buried." Ivy refused to step back. "Like the secret of who murdered my mother?" she asked directly. For a moment, Marcus was still. The smile on his face never wavered, but his eyes grew cold. "Be careful, miss," he warned. "When you dig in the past, you can awaken things that are better left sleeping. There are monsters in that darkness. Do not wake them." They stood facing one another in the tight, musty room. Then Marcus cocked his head, as if he had just recalled something. "Ah, have you learned anything about the leather jacket?" Ivy froze completely. The leather jacket? She had only mentioned that detail to Damien in the private room of the restaurant on the evening they first met. Nobody else could have known. How did Marcus know? It seemed Marcus knew he had made a mistake. His smile grew wider, becoming smoother and more practiced, a mask to hide his error. "Damien told me," he said without hesitation. "We keep no secrets from one another. I am his most trusted advisor after all." "Yes," Ivy said, making herself smile back. "I understand." But inside, a siren was screaming. Damien would never have shared such a detail. Not with anyone. He guarded her secrets too closely to ever tell another person about her past. Marcus knew about the jacket. Marcus was asking if she had found anything. Marcus had appeared at the precise moment she was looking for answers. This was no accident. "You should return to your room and get some sleep," Marcus said, pulling the archive door open. "It is late. This is not good for you." Ivy walked out, feeling his stare like a physical weight on her back the entire way down the hall. The moment she was in her room, she closed the door and sagged against it, her heart beating a frantic rhythm. She was certain of one thing. Marcus Kane was not a good man. He was hiding something, and he was watching her every move. She had to locate the man in the leather jacket before Marcus could. She needed to act immediately. The following night, Ivy made her move. She stayed awake until the clock showed 1 in the morning, when a deep quiet fell over the entire estate. She swapped her nightgown for black jeans and a dark hoodie she had concealed in the bottom of her closet. She put her phone in her pocket, tied the laces on her sneakers, and walked to the window. Her room was on the second story, but an old, sturdy trellis for climbing plants was fastened to the stone wall. She had examined it for days, deciding it was strong enough to support her. After opening the window and taking a deep breath, she climbed outside. The night air was cold against her skin. Her hands found their grip on the dry vines. Her feet felt for solid places on the knotted wood. Her heart hammered against her ribs as if it would break free. A fall from this height would mean broken bones. If anyone found her, she could not even guess what Damien might do. But she had no other option. She had to discover the truth. She moved down inch by inch, taking great care to avoid the fragile branches that could snap and betray her. Finally, her feet touched the soft earth. She stayed in the shadows and watched. A security camera at the corner of the house panned slowly across the yard. She waited for its lens to turn away, then she sprinted toward the fence. The guards walked their routes on a strict schedule she had been observing all week. She knew they would check the side gate in 5 minutes. That was enough time. She scaled the fence at the far end of the garden, where thick trees hid her from view. Her clothing caught and tore on the branches, but she paid it no mind. She followed a thin trail behind the estate until she hit the main road, where she used an app on her phone to summon a taxi. The 10-minute wait felt like it lasted an entire century. When the yellow car finally stopped for her, she leaped inside as if escaping from a nightmare. "The South Industrial District," she told the driver. 30 minutes later, Damien concluded his meeting and came back to the estate. As he always did, he went to Ivy's room to look in on her. But when he got there, the door was slightly open, and the room was empty. The bed had not been slept in. The window was open to the night, its curtains blowing in the wind. He stood frozen for a second, then two, before his anger erupted. Damien spun around and slammed his fist directly into the large mirror on the wall. The glass exploded. Blood streamed from his knuckles, but he felt no pain. He felt only a single emotion. It was fear. The fear that he was losing her, that he would lose her a second time, just like he did 26 years ago. "Find her!" he roared at the bodyguards who had run in at the sound of the mirror shattering. "Search every corner of this city. Do it now!" Marcus Kane stood in the doorway, his face a mask of concern. "What is wrong?" "She is gone," Damien said, his voice a low growl through his teeth. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Let me assist you. I have eyes and ears all over the city. We will locate her." Damien agreed, too consumed by worry to see the strange, cold light in Marcus's eyes. Marcus took out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and a brief, triumphant smile touched his lips as Ivy's GPS coordinates lit up his screen. At the same time, Ivy was making her way through the old industrial zone in the southern part of the city. It was a landscape of abandoned factories, rusted-out garages, and dirty bars. She approached everyone she saw. "Do you know an old mechanic? He wears a leather jacket, has an old motorcycle. He might have been around here about 26 years ago." Most people just shook their heads or motioned for her to leave. A few gave her looks as if she were insane. She was close to giving up when a drunk man sitting by the door of a rundown bar caught her by the hand. "Leather jacket," he slurred, his breath thick with the smell of cheap liquor. "Old mechanic. You mean old Walt?" Ivy fell to her knees in front of him. "Do you know where I can find him?" The man let out a rattling laugh. "Everyone knows that crazy old fool lives under the East Bridge, completely mad. Talks all day about the little girl from the rainy night. He shook his head. It has been over 20 years and he still goes on about it. He is totally nuts. The little girl from the rainy night. Ivy's heart seemed to stop beating. That was her. She was the girl from that rainy night. She jumped to her feet and ran for the East Bridge. Her feet pounded against the pavement, and her heart felt like it would burst from her chest. She was close to finding the truth. She was about to discover what really happened on that night 26 years in the past. She had no idea that in the darkness behind her, a convoy of black cars was moving without a sound, following the signal from the phone in her pocket. And the man leading them was not Damien. Under the East Bridge, it was another world. It was dark and damp, and the smell of spoiled garbage and sewage was so thick, it felt like a coating in her throat. The streetlights were so faint their glow only reached a few yards. Everything else was lost in a deep, consuming blackness. Ivy walked forward, her shoes making splashing sounds in dirty puddles as her eyes struggled to see. She saw crude shelters made from cardboard and ripped tarps. Figures sat in the shadows, either sleeping or watching her with tired eyes. Then she spotted him. He was a shape curled up in the farthest corner under a cracked cement ledge. His hair was as white as snow and fell to his shoulders. A thick beard covered most of his face, and his clothes were torn and filthy. But as Ivy got closer, she saw his eyes. They were still sharp, still full of life, holding on to something that had not been extinguished by all the years that had passed. "Are you Walter Morris?" Ivy asked, her voice trembling with anxiety. "The man with the old motorcycle and the leather jacket?" The old man recoiled, shuffling deeper into the shadows. "Someone is here," he mumbled, his voice hoarse as if he had not used it in a very long time. "What is it you want? I have nothing. Go away." Ivy moved a step closer. "I did not come here to take anything from you. I came to learn the truth about the night on Raven's Peak, about the car that fell from the cliff on Raven's Peak, about the pregnant woman who was in that car." Old Walt became very still. "What are you talking about?" Ivy took one more step, and the dim streetlight illuminated her chest, catching the gold token she wore around her neck. The pendant shone in the gloom like a tiny star. Old Walt's eyes fixed on it. They grew wide, and his entire body started to tremble. Then he began to weep. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face, getting lost in his white beard. "My little girl," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You are alive. For all these years, a whole lifetime, I wondered if you were alive, or if you were dead. And now, you are here. You are alive." A knot formed in Ivy's chest. "So it was you," she said. "You were the one who saved me that night." Old Walt nodded, his tears still flowing. He guided Ivy to sit beside him, and his trembling, calloused hand wrapped around hers. Then he started his story, his voice hollow and heavy, like a sound pulled up from deep in the past. "That night I was riding my motorcycle up Raven's Peak. The rain was coming down in sheets. I could hardly make out the road. Then I saw them. Black cars flew past me, driving at a reckless speed. They ran another car right off the road. I heard the sound of crunching metal, shattering glass, and a scream. Then the car went over the cliff." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "The black cars just kept going. They did not stop. I was the only person there. I scrambled down the cliff, sliding down the wet slope. The car was upside down and smoking. And I saw her, Catherine. She was still breathing, covered in blood, but she was alive. She was holding her stomach, protecting the baby that was inside." "My mother," Ivy whispered, her own tears now falling freely. Old Walt nodded. "She looked right at me. Her eyes. I will never forget her eyes. They were full of pain, but also full of resolve. She took my hand and said, 'Save my child. Please, you must save my child.'" He wiped at his own tears, with his tattered jacket sleeve. In that moment, she gave birth. She used her final ounce of strength right there in the twisted metal. "I delivered the baby. You You were so tiny, so new and red, your cries cutting through the rainy darkness. She only looked at you once, just a single glance. Then she removed her necklace and tied it around your neck, making a knot so secure I struggled to fasten it. She whispered something in your ear. I heard her. What did she say? Ivy asked, her voice tight. Old Walt met her gaze, his eyes pained and bloodshot. She said, "Find your father. This will guide you home. Live. You must live for me." Ivy wept. She cried with an abandon she had never known. An entire life spent wondering about her mother, almost 30 years believing she was thrown away. But that was not the truth. Her mother had fought for her to survive. Her mother had spent her last breath making sure she was safe. And then she passed away. Old Walt continued, his voice like a tired sigh. Right in my arms. I held you as I watched her spirit leave. Why did you not call the authorities? Ivy questioned. Why abandon me at that home for children? Old Walt lowered his head, overcome with shame. I have a criminal history. I was afraid they would accuse me. I also knew the mob was involved. The cars had an insignia I recognized. Speaking up would have been a death sentence. He gently squeezed Ivy's hand. I brought you to the orphanage, left you on the doorstep, and vanished. I carried that guilt and fear for years. I am so sorry, so very sorry. Ivy put her arms around the old man. My mother fought so I could have a life, she said, her voice cracking. And you were the one who saved me. You have nothing to be sorry for. Just then, the sound of tires screaming on pavement shattered the quiet under the bridge. Ivy glanced up to see Damon running toward them. His eyes were intense, his whole body coiled with tension. But his advance stopped the moment he saw her tears. He looked from old Walt to Ivy, and understanding dawned on his face. You are the one who rescued her, Damon said, his tone softening. Old Walt stood up, his body shaking. I am sorry. I should have come forward a long time ago. Damon had no chance to reply. A second pair of headlights flooded the space beneath the bridge, blinding them. This was not his car. A convoy of black sedans rolled to a halt, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Marcus Kane. A cold smile played on his lips. I have found you, he said. All three of you. Damon reacted instantly, moving to shield Ivy while drawing his weapon in one fluid motion. Marcus's men had already fanned out, blocking every possible escape route from under the bridge. The intense glare from their cars cast long, distorted shadows on the concrete walls. Marcus! Damon snarled. What is the meaning of this? Marcus just smiled, the same smile Ivy remembered from her first days at the mansion. But it was different now. It was cold and cruel. Just like you, Marcus answered, his voice smooth. I am here for our young lady. I did not summon you, Damon stated, his gun still aimed directly at Marcus. There was no need, Marcus shrugged. I am always aware of everything. It is my responsibility. Do not forget, I am your closest advisor. I have served this family for more than half my life. I know every move you make, every choice, and every single weakness. The air grew heavy with unspoken threats. Ivy remained behind Damon, her hand gripping old Walt's trembling arm. Then, Marcus let out a sigh. His smile disappeared. The friendly mask fell away, exposing the man beneath. His expression was cold, greedy, and filled with a deep hatred. What a pity, Marcus said, his voice stripped of its warmth. I had hoped the girl would never locate this old man. Things would have been far easier. She could have remained the family's innocent little princess, knowing nothing, doing nothing. I would have continued to wait. But now, she knows far too much. Damon centered his aim right between Marcus's eyes. What did you just say? Marcus glared at Damon with pure contempt. 26 years, Damon. I have waited for a lifetime. 26 years. I believed the girl had died along with her mother. It was a flawless plan. Catherine dies. The infant dies. Victor falls apart. The family would require a new leader. And I should have been that leader. You are a traitor, Ivy shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and horror. Marcus shifted his gaze to her. A traitor? He let out a chilling laugh. No, my dear. I am simply taking what is rightfully mine. Victor made me promises. Power, status, a real future. I was the one who built this empire with him from nothing. And then he adopted some boy from the street. Marcus turned back to Damon, his eyes burning with hatred. 26 years of loyalty, 26 years of dedication, and I was never more than an advisor. But you, a child he found in the gutter, you were named the boss. Can you even imagine how that feels? Damon stood motionless. He stared at the man he had trusted for 25 years, the man who had mentored him, the man who had been by his side for every major decision. You gave them Catherine's itinerary, Damon said, his voice strained. Marcus nodded without a hint of remorse. You are finally catching on. Yes, I provided the information. The exact time she left the hospital, her travel route, the number of bodyguards, all of it. Preston Cole compensated me very well. Preston Cole, Damon repeated through clenched teeth. Oh, you were not aware. Marcus laughed. Preston was the true architect of the plan. I merely supplied the necessary details. It was perfect. Catherine dies. The baby dies. Victor shatters. The family descends into chaos. Preston assumes control. And I finally receive the reward I have earned. Marcus took a breath. But then you showed up. An 11-year-old boy kneeling before Victor and pledging your loyalty. Victor looked at you as if you were his salvation. He gave you everything, and I was forced to continue waiting. For 26 years, Damon, I waited for you to fail. I waited for you to die. I waited for my chance. Marcus then looked at Ivy. And now this girl appears, holding the token, holding the inheritance, destroying everything I worked for. Marcus raised his gun. This time, I will finish it myself. There will be no mistakes. He aimed the weapon at old Walt. Kill the old man. He swung it toward Ivy. Kill the girl. Then his eyes settled on Damon. And as for you, you will die branded a traitor. I will tell everyone you conspired with our enemies to steal Ashford assets. You murdered Victor's daughter, and I, the faithful advisor, eliminated you to avenge her. Old Walt stumbled backward, shaking. Please, sir, he pleaded. I am just a harmless old man. But Ivy moved forward. She stood directly in front of old Walt, her chin high, her eyes locked on Marcus. If you intend to kill him, you will have to kill me first. Marcus observed her, momentarily surprised, before he laughed. You are brave, just like your mother. Catherine had that same courage. She looked directly into the headlights of the cars racing toward her, and she never made a sound. He leveled the pistol at Ivy. As you wish. Damon yelled, Marcus! The gunshot echoed through the night. Damon moved toward Ivy with incredible speed. In less than a second, he threw her to the pavement and covered her with his body. The bullet that was meant for her head tore through his left shoulder. A spray of hot blood erupted, splashing across Ivy's face. She let out a scream of terror, but Damon did not falter. He gritted his teeth against the searing pain, spun around, and returned fire at Marcus. In that same instant, the roar of powerful engines filled the space under the bridge. 3 more black cars sped into the underpass. These were Damon's men, the team that had been discreetly tailing him from the estate. They jumped out of the vehicles with weapons already drawn, and the area erupted in a firefight. The underpass became a vision of hell. Gunshots cracked like thunder. Muzzle flashes illuminated the darkness in sharp, violent strobes. The smell of gunpowder and blood mingled in the air until it was thick enough to taste. Marcus's men fought back wildly, but Damon's team was larger and far more skilled. One by one, the attackers fell. Damon got to his feet, his left shoulder bleeding freely, but he fought as if he felt no pain at all. He moved with the speed of a phantom, taking down a man who was advancing on Ivy. Then he turned to confront Marcus. The rage in his eyes was more intense than any fire. Old Walt pulled Ivy behind a thick concrete pillar, shielding her with his own body. A stray bullet grazed his leg, drawing blood, but he held on tight. "Stay down!" he yelled into Ivy's ear. "Keep your head down!" Marcus took cover behind a car and shot back at Damon. "You were always Victor's faithful dog," he screamed above the chaos. "But a dog can never be the master. You will always be that street kid he took pity on." Damon eliminated another man trying to cover Marcus. "You are wrong," he replied, his voice as cold as steel. "My loyalty was never to Victor." He leaped over a metal drum, closing the gap between them. "My loyalty is to the Ashford family." Another shot rang out from his gun, and the last of Marcus's men collapsed. Damon glanced toward Ivy. "She is the only Ashford that remains." Marcus was out of ammunition. He tossed his empty gun aside, drew a knife, and lunged at Damon. The two men collided like ferocious beasts. Marcus swung the blade. Damon dodged, but the wound in his shoulder made him slower than usual. The knife sliced a deep gash along Damon's arm. More blood streamed out, but Damon did not retreat. He drove his fist into Marcus's jaw, throwing him off balance. Then he kicked out at Marcus's knee, forcing him to buckle. He finished with a devastating punch to Marcus's temple. Marcus fell hard to the ground, his knife clattering away. Damon pinned him down, pressing the muzzle of his gun to Marcus's head, his finger resting on the trigger. Marcus lay there, blood trickling from his nose and mouth, but he was laughing. The unhinged sound bounced off the concrete walls now that the gunfire had stopped. "Do it," he said. "Kill me, Damon, but you will never find out who the real leader is." "Preston Cole, do you have any idea where he is? Do you know his current plans?" Damon went still. His finger remained on the trigger, but he did not apply pressure. "Kill me, and your only link is gone," Marcus taunted. "Let me live, and you might have a chance to learn everything." Damon ground his teeth. He wanted nothing more than to end the traitor's life right there. But logic stopped him. He needed Marcus. He needed answers. "Tie him up," Damon commanded. He told his men, "If that man moves, put a bullet in his leg." Ivy scrambled toward Damien the moment he was on his feet. His blood was smeared across her cheeks. Her eyes were swollen and red from terror. She saw the hole in his shoulder and the gash along his arm, and the world began to spin. "You were shot because of me," she whispered, her voice cracking. But Damien paid no attention to his own wounds. He raised a hand to her face, his touch gentle as he checked for any injuries. "Are you hurt?" Ivy could only stare, completely shocked. "You are the one who is bleeding," she said. "You have a bullet in you, and you are asking if I am okay?" Damien met her gaze, and the hardness in his dark eyes seemed to melt away. "I promised you," he said, his voice raw with pain but solid as a mountain. "Nobody lays a hand on you. Nobody." At that moment, the phone in Damien's pocket began to vibrate. He pulled it out, and as he looked at the screen, his face lost all its color. "What happened?" Ivy asked. Damien looked from her to Marcus, who was bound on the floor. "Victor is dying," he said, his voice strained. "And Preston Cole just called an emergency meeting of the family council." Damien dropped down in front of Marcus, grabbing the man's collar and hauling him upward. "Who is the one behind this?" he roared. "Who paid for Catherine's betrayal?" Marcus spit a stream of blood on the floor before he started to laugh. It was the laugh of a man with nothing left to lose. "Preston Cole," he said. "He was behind everything. He paid for it. He designed the whole plan. He has wanted to consume the Ashford family since 26 years ago. What else?" Damien tightened his hold on the man's shirt. "I want to know everything." But Marcus just laughed again and then fell silent. He looked at Damien with pure defiance. "If you want the details, you have to ensure I survive. I am the only person who can witness against him. Without me, you have nothing on Preston." Damien wanted to hit him, but he understood Marcus was correct. He got to his feet and spoke to his men. "Tie him up and take him with us. If he tries to escape, shoot him in both knees." The procession of cars cut through the night, slicing through the darkness of Blackwood City. Damien was in a back seat as one of his men tied a makeshift bandage around his shoulder. Blood immediately began to soak through the material. He was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were still burning with resolve. Ivy sat next to him, her hand clutching his. "You have to go to a hospital," she said, her voice filled with anxiety. "Later," Damien said without looking at her. "Victor is first, then Preston. Preston is going to pay for his actions." Back at the Ashford estate, the council chamber was a blaze of light in the dead of night. The 10 most senior family members were seated around the long table made of oak, every face etched with worry and fear. Preston Cole was standing at the head of the table, in the spot where Damien was supposed to be. "This is a very grave situation," Preston announced, his voice low and full of false worry. "Victor is not going to survive. The doctors do not expect him to last through the night. And Damien, our supposed leader, has disappeared. Nobody can find him. Nobody can contact him." He scanned the faces at the table, ensuring they were all listening. "The Ashford family has no heir of its own blood," Preston went on. "Catherine died 26 years ago, and her unborn child died with her. Damien is merely an adopted son who has no legal claim to inheritance according to our laws. And now, at the very moment of Victor's passing, he runs away. What do you suppose that suggests?" A quiet rumble of conversation started around the table. A couple of the members started to nod in agreement. "This family needs stability," Preston declared, his voice firm. "We require a leader with experience, someone who was at Victor's side from the very beginning. I propose that the council vote to remove Damien Blackwood and install a temporary leader until things are settled." In a different car that was following Damien, old Walt was getting help putting on clean clothes from an assistant. The injury on his leg was now bandaged. He looked at the new garments, then to the phone screen where Ivy was on a video call. "I will give my testimony," old Walt said, his voice shaking but determined. "I will stand in front of them all and tell them what I witnessed that night. I owe that much to Catherine." "Are you not afraid?" Ivy asked. "These people are gangsters. If you speak out against Preston, your life will be in danger." Old Walt stared at her through the small screen. His old eyes had a spark of conviction that had been missing for 26 years. "I have been afraid for 26 years, young lady," he told her. "For decades, I lived like a scared animal, hiding from every noise. That is over. It is time for me to do what is right." The cars came to a stop at the gates of the Ashford property. The light from the council chamber was still burning. Damien looked out the window for a moment, then turned his head to Ivy. His face was white, but his eyes were on fire. "Are you ready?" Ivy asked. Damien gave her hand a final squeeze before he pushed the car door open. "Let's go," he said. "Let's finish this." The doors of the council chamber flew open with a sound like thunder. The 10 most powerful members of the Ashford family all turned around. Preston Cole stood frozen at the head of the table, the confident smile on his face instantly gone. Damien Blackwood walked in, his left shoulder bandaged, with a terrifying red stain spreading across the white cloth. He was pale from his wound, but his dark eyes burned like hot coals. But he did not arrive by himself. Ivy walked in right beside Damien. She was not the scared cleaning girl from the restaurant anymore. In a simple black dress she had quickly changed into, she looked transformed. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she held her chin up with a new confidence. Around her neck, the gold token shone under the bright lights like a single star in the night sky. "You wanted a blood heir," Damien announced, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Here she is, Rosalie Ashford, the one and only daughter of Victor and Catherine Ashford, and she is wearing the sacred token of the family." The room exploded with noise. Whispers spread like wildfire. The council members looked from Ivy to the token, and then to each other, their faces full of shock. Preston recovered his composure. "That's absurd," he said in a loud voice, trying to be heard over the noise. This is an imposter, a servant girl who showed up with a fake piece of jewelry. You cannot believe this trickster. Ivy stepped forward. She looked directly into Preston's eyes, her gaze steady and without fear. 26 years ago, you had my mother killed. The room became completely silent. Preston's eyes grew wide. Do you dare accuse me with no evidence? You thought I was gone, didn't you? Ivy continued, her voice as cold as ice. You thought the baby inside my mother died with her at the bottom of that ravine. But I am here, and I brought a witness. The door opened again. Old Walt entered, limping a little from his injury, but his posture was straight and his head was high. He was no longer the man in rags from under the bridge. In his fresh clothes, with determination in his eyes, he looked like he was ready to face the past. My name is Walter Morris, he said, his voice clear and powerful. I was on Raven's Peak 26 years ago. I saw them push Catherine Ashford's car off the road and over the cliff. I went down to try to save her. I took the baby from her arms right before she died. And I saw the people who did it. They were in black cars with a symbol on the side. Old Walt raised his hand and pointed it right at Preston. It was your symbol. Preston took a step back, his face turning pale. This is just the rambling of a crazy old man, he said, his voice starting to shake. It proves nothing. Then Marcus Kane was brought in by 2 guards, his hands cuffed. He looked around the room at the faces looking back at him and knew he was trapped. Speak, Damien commanded. In front of this council, tell them everything you told me. Marcus took a long breath. Preston Cole paid me for Catherine's schedule on that night. The time she would leave the hospital, her route, how many guards she had, all of it. Preston paid men to force her car over the edge. Preston needed Victor to break down so he could take over the Ashford family. 26 years ago, Preston Cole murdered Catherine Ashford. Preston snapped. Marcus, he yelled, his face turning purple with anger. You swore you would keep quiet. You gave your word that you would never tell anyone. He stopped, realizing what he had just admitted in front of the entire council. The room was absolutely still. Not a single person made a sound. Damien approached Preston, his black eyes like deep, empty wells. 26 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. You stood by Victor and pretended to be sad. You watched him fall apart after losing his wife and child. You waited for him to die so you could have everything. But you forgot something important. And Ashford always survives. The council did not take long to decide. The vote was quick and unanimous. Preston Cole and Marcus Kane were banished from the family to face judgment by their laws, which was essentially a death sentence. Then all eyes turned to Ivy. She stepped forward to the spot where Preston had been standing. She looked at the strange faces waiting for her to speak. I did not grow up in this life, Ivy said, her voice soft but strong. I do not know your traditions. I do not know how to lead a family, but I do know about justice, and I do know what family means. She looked at Damien, who was leaning against the wall with exhaustion, but had not taken his eyes off her. Damien Blackwood has protected this family for 19 years. He made a vow to my father when he was just an 11-year-old boy. He will continue to be the leader. As for myself, I will learn. I will learn to be an Ashford who is worthy of the name, and I will not allow anyone to hurt my family ever again, not ever. For a second, there was only silence. Then, one after another, the council members got to their feet. They bowed their heads to Ivy, to Rosalie Ashford, to the lost princess who had returned home after 26 years. The moment the council was over, Ivy ran toward Victor's room. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and her feet felt unsteady on the long stretch of hallway. She knew he was leaving her. She knew she was almost out of time. Ivy threw the bedroom door open and hurried to his side. Victor lay on the enormous bed, covered in crisp white sheets. His frame was so thin he looked like he might just disappear into the fabric. Beside him, a heart monitor beeped out a slow, constant rhythm. The doctor and nurses stood in a corner, their faces grim, shaking their heads. But as Ivy reached the bed, Victor's eyes opened. They were clouded with age and illness, but they suddenly became clear. He smiled, and it was the most peaceful expression Ivy had ever seen. "You did it," Victor whispered, his voice as faint as a passing breeze. Ivy fell to her knees at his bedside and clasped his wrinkled hand. Tears streamed down her face. "Father," she said, and for the first time in her entire life, the word felt real. "Preston and Marcus are in custody. It is all over. They will face justice." "Good." Victor gave a slight nod, his gaze locked on her. "Good." He raised his other hand, which trembled, and gently touched her cheek. "You have your mother's looks," he said. "So strong, so beautiful. Catherine had eyes just like yours, full of fire, impossible to break." "Father," Ivy sobbed. 26 years, Victor continued, his voice a weary sigh. "Every single day since that crash, I never knew you were still alive. I have spent all this time drowning in regret. I believed I had lost you, my wife, everything. I thought my life would end in loneliness and guilt." He stopped, struggling for a deep breath. "But now I can see Catherine again," he said, the smile returning to his face. "I can finally tell her." "Tell her what?" Ivy asked, her voice choked with emotion. "That our daughter became someone truly wonderful," Victor replied. "That her sacrifice was not for nothing. That our Rosalie has returned home." Damien walked into the room, pausing at the foot of the bed. He had a fresh bandage on his wound, but his face was still pale. He stood there without a word, watching the adoptive father who was now slipping away. Damien's dark eyes slowly turned red. Victor noticed him. "My son," he called out. Damien approached the bed and stood beside Ivy. "Father," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. Victor looked at him with profound love. "I found you on the streets 26 years ago," he said. "You were just a skinny, dirty boy with eyes full of anger at the entire world. I thought I was the one saving you, but the truth is, you are the one who saved me." "Father," Damien's voice cracked. "You pulled me out of the darkness," Victor went on. "After Catherine was gone, I wanted to be gone too. There was no reason for me to live, but then you showed up. You got on your knees and swore an oath to me. You gave me a purpose to keep fighting. You held this family together when I was too weak. You found Rosalie when I had lost all hope." He held out his hand, and Damien took it. Victor now lay there, holding Ivy's hand in one of his and Damien's in the other. "You are my son," Victor said, his tone certain despite his weakness. "You have always been my son, not because of shared blood, but because of your heart." Damien bowed his head, his voice shaking. "I will protect her," he said. "I swear on my life." Victor nodded, the serene smile never leaving his lips. "I know. I have always known, ever since you were a boy. I knew you would honor your promise." He looked at both of them, at Ivy and Damien, his two children. One was his by birth, the other his by heart, but they were both his family. "Live," Victor said, his voice becoming quieter, as if it were melting into the air. "Live for one another, live for this family, and find happiness. Be happy for me, and for Catherine." "Father," Ivy cried. Victor's eyes closed, but the smile remained. "Catherine," he whispered, as if speaking to someone only he could see. "I am on my way. Wait for me." Just then, the heart monitor let out a single long tone, and the line on the screen went flat. Victor Ashford was gone. He had passed peacefully and calmly. After more than 2 decades of painful waiting, he had finally met his daughter. At last, he was reunited with his wife. Ivy slumped against the bed, her body shaking with sobs. Her cries filled the quiet room, a raw and desperate sound of grief. She had only just found her father, and now he was gone. Damien remained beside her, staring down at Victor's calm face. and for the first time in 26 years, he let himself cry. Tears traced silent paths down his cheeks, falling onto the white bedding. He had not cried when he watched Catherine die. He had not cried through 26 years of hardship and heavy burdens, but he was crying now. He reached out and gently brushed the tears from Ivy's face. "He held on for you," Damien said. "He got to meet his daughter in the end. He left this world in peace." Ivy looked up at him, her eyes swollen and red. "You lost your father too." Damien gave a small shake of his head. "He is not gone," he said. "He is alive in you, and in me. He is in every single thing we do, from this day forward." The Ashford family cemetery rested on a hill with a view of Blackwood City. The sunset painted the sky in shades of red. The last rays of sunlight touched the rows of white marble headstones. Victor Ashford's funeral was a quiet, solemn, and private affair. Only the family's most trusted inner circle was invited. There were no reporters and no strangers, just family. Victor was buried next to Catherine. After a quarter of a century, they could finally be together once more. Two graves stood side by side, their stone markers engraved with names and dates, and a simple phrase beneath them: "Forever together." Ivy stood before her parents' graves with Damien next to her. A gentle evening wind softly touched the white rose petals she had laid upon Catherine's headstone. She stared down at the engraved name of the woman who gave her life, the one who died so that she might escape. "Mother," Ivy whispered, her voice barely a sound. "I made it home. I found my father. I finally know the whole truth. I will build a life that honors the price you paid for me. I swear it." They remained there in the quiet for several minutes. It was Damien who finally spoke. "What will you do now?" he asked. "You have everything: influence, wealth, a family. Your options are limitless." Ivy looked at him directly. "I want to create a foundation," she said. "For orphans, for children just like I was, kids who have to grow up without knowing their parents, kids who are always waiting for someone to come and finally take them home." She turned her gaze back to Catherine's grave. "So another child does not have to wait almost 3 decades for a family," she added. "So nobody ever has to feel as alone as I did." Damien observed her, a rare softness in his eyes. "The Catherine Foundation," he said, naming it. A genuine smile touched Ivy's lips for the first time since Victor's death. "The Catherine Foundation," she affirmed. A short distance away, old Walt stood in the clean, new attire Damien had provided for him. The wound on his leg was now properly cared for. He was no longer the broken-down old man from beneath the bridge. His dignity had been restored to him. "I honored my promise to Catherine," old Walt said as Ivy walked over to him. "She told me to save her baby, and now you are home." Ivy wrapped her arms around him, embracing the stranger who had saved her life on 2 separate occasions. Once from the crash 26 years ago, and again when he found the strength to come forward and testify. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." Old Walt gently patted her on the back. "I am leaving now," he told her. "Mr. Damien has set up a small house for me just outside the city. I am going to live out the rest of my life in peace." "You have earned your rest," Ivy said. Old Walt nodded and smiled, then walked away. His form disappeared among the cemetery's trees. Soon, only Damien and Ivy were left standing before the 2 graves. The sun had set completely, and the sky was now a deep shade of purple. The first few stars were beginning to shine. "So what happens now?" Ivy asked. Damien looked at her. "Now, we live," he replied. "For Victor, for Catherine, and for us." The great expanse of time could not break the bonds of family. Then she asked, her voice soft, "Will you still stand watch outside my door every night?" Damien looked at her, and for the very first time, his eyes showed no coldness, no obsession, and no need for control. There was only something gentle and warm. "No," he said. Ivy looked at him, surprised by his answer. No. Damien took a step closer. I will not stand outside your door any longer, he said, his voice low and full of warmth. I will be right beside you, always, if you will let me. Ivy looked at him. This was the man who had dedicated years to finding her. The man who had been wounded for her. The man who had kept his promise to her father since he was just an 11-year-old boy. And she nodded. Damien raised his hand and rested it on her shoulder. It felt strong and protective, but for the first time, it was also gentle. Ivy's fingers went to the token around her neck. It was the golden pendant her mother had given her with her dying breath. Mother, she whispered, I am home. Damien stood right behind her, his hand still on her shoulder. They looked out at Blackwood City together. The city lights were beginning to glow in the night. The dark times were over. The betrayers had been brought to justice. The truth had finally been revealed. But in this world, the darkness never truly goes away. There would be more challenges in the future. New enemies would appear, and secrets were still waiting to be found. But from now on, Ivy would not have to face any of it by herself. The tale of the lost princess and the Mafia boss concludes here, but the lesson from their story will always remain. It is a lesson about a love that can travel across time. More than 2 decades of separation could not destroy a family. It is a lesson about loyalty and sacrifice. Damien devoted his entire life to honoring a single promise. Catherine used her final moments to save her child. To save her child. It is also a story about the bravery it takes to confront your past. For 26 years, old Walt was paralyzed by fear, but when it mattered most, he found his voice and revealed the truth. And more than anything, this is a story about hope. It does not matter how deep the darkness is that life throws you into, or how isolated and lost you become. There is always a way that leads back home. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel, hitting the like button, and sharing this video. It gives us the encouragement we need to continue creating meaningful stories for you every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it bring up any memories from your own life? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We genuinely want to hear what is on your mind. We hope that everyone watching this finds good health, happiness, and peace in their daily lives. Thank you for being with us for the entire story. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in our next video model.